Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the last coffee talk of this series. So my name is Annemieke Smit, and I'm a contractor with Alberta Milk to help them with their research and extension activities. And I'm also a postdoc at the University of Calgary. So today, we will have Greg Penner talk about feeding and automatic milking systems. And Jody will shortly put some housekeeping rules and tips and tricks for using the Q&A in the chat. And with that, I will like to hand it over to Greg.
All right, I think I should be in order. Hopefully everyone can hear me just fine. I'm really excited to be here as part of this coffee talk, and I'm going to talk today about feeding cows in robotic dairies. And really what I want to do today is actually focus on, focus on, I guess, the myths or some of the myths that are associated with automated milking systems. So I'm going to challenge these concepts, and hopefully through our discussion, we can determine whether these are truths or simply myths. The first one I'm going to cover is feeding more concentrate in the automated milking system can actually reduce negative energy balance for cows in early lactation. We're going to talk about whether altering quantities of concentrate in the robot can allow for precision feeding, and whether feeding management needs to differ between guided flow and free flow barns, and then finally, whether or not pellets are actually required as a feed in the AMS. So let's get right at the first one. The first myth that I want to challenge is whether or not feeding more concentrate in the robot can be used to reduce negative energy balance. So I'm pulling some data that Dr. Megan King, who's now at the University of Manitoba, as well as Dr. Trevor DeVries at the University of Guelph, published in the Journal of Dairy Science. And in this study, they were characterizing robotic milked cows on commercial farms in Ontario based on their risk for subclinical ketosis, clinical ketosis, and then they had clinical ketosis in association with other transition disorders or just other disease. And what I want to highlight is that green highlighted area where they're looking at supplement intake. And in this case, this is the amount of concentrate that they're getting in the robot. And I want to highlight that there was absolutely no association between the amount of concentrate that those cows consumed in the robot and their disease risk category. So this really challenges whether providing more supplement in the robot might actually reduce risk for negative energy balance. Work done at the University of Saskatchewan has tested this concept, not directly targeting negative energy balance, but more or less challenging or questioning whether providing more energy through the robot pellet might alleviate some of the challenges we're dealing with when feeding early lactation cows. So obviously, because we're in a robot, we had to feed a single PMR. And so that PMR was designed to meet most of the maintenance energy or metabolizable energy and metabolizable protein allowable milk yield, so about 90%. And our target yield was 40 kilos of milk with a 4.1% milk fat and about a 3.1 true protein. We then, within the treatments, so they all received the same PMR, but they received one of 3 different AMS feeding strategies. So 3 kilos a day. They were adapted to from 3 to 8 kilos a day over 15 days for the moderate adaptation treatment, or they were adapted from 3 kilos to 8 kilos over 5 days for the rapid adaptation treatment. And these cows started this experiment on day 1 of lactation. So it was the day following calving. What I want to highlight is again, we did achieve higher AMS pellet intake for those cows that were on the moderate or the rapid treatments, but they did not achieve their target. We were targeting 8 kilos by week 3 for the moderate group and 8 kilos by week 2 for the rapid group. Neither group achieved those targets. And furthermore, they didn't achieve those targets even out between week 5 and 8 of lactation. So we did deliver more concentrate, but they didn't get as much as we had intended them to get. We saw impacts on PMR intake, And so in this case, no statistical effect in terms of low AMS allocation versus high AMS allocation, but there was a tendency for those cows on the high AMS allocation to consume less PMR. And so we need to think about that as we're considering our robotic feeding management strategies. Milking frequency actually tended to be higher for those cows with low AMS allocation. And when we looked at milk yield, we did not find a difference between the AMS feeding strategies. Again, these cows were all consuming the same PMR. However, when we looked at fat yield, we did see an increase in fat yield for those cows that were fed the low AMS allocation relative to those that were on either the moderate or the rapid high AMS allocations. And more relevant to the myth that I'm challenging is we did not observe any differences in body weight, body condition score, plasma glucose, serum beta hydroxybutyric acid concentration, so a potential indicator of negative energy balance. And even when we looked at milk BHB, we did not see any effect of our AMS feeding strategy. So this really points to me to suggest that maybe we're misleading ourselves in terms of thinking that providing more concentrate in the robot could actually be used to reduce that negative energy balance. Myth 2 is really dealing with whether altering concentrate quantities in the AMS allows for precision feeding. This is a much more complex story, and we've shown this type of data numerous times where the actual amount targeted, so those values in red, and particularly if you look at the first 3 vertical bars there, you can see those red bars are the amounts that the researchers tried to target, and those gray bars are the amounts that cows actually consume. And so you can see that there's a very large discrepancy between what the cows are offered and what those cows might actually consume in that AMS, or sorry, what is actually delivered in the AMS, not even consumed. There's work coming out of Alex Bach's group in Spain showing that the more we try to offer in the AMS, so the concentrate allowance, it is related to greater concentrate that's actually refused. So this would be pellet or concentrate that would remain in the robot when the cow exits, and that remaining concentrate is potentially available for the cow following. So there's a pretty steep response curve for this outcome where once we get above that 5.5 kilos of concentrate allocation per day in the AMS, we start seeing a pretty rapid increase in the amount of concentrate that those cows would leave behind or refuse. We also know that this has been shown in several other experiments. So this is an experiment from a free flow barn with automated milking systems that allow for collection of the refusals once cows leave. I just want to highlight a couple points. The dark bars here are for cows that were fed increased amounts of concentrate in the AMS as they progressed in lactation. The dashed bars are for cows that received a static AMS concentrate allocation. The allocation was really not different during early lactation. This was the first 14 days in milk, but you can see that those cows offered higher concentrate allocations during mid and late lactation. So basically, the majority of the lactation, those cows offered more, refused more concentrate that was delivered. And this is potentially problematic because if you look at your herd management software through your robotic milking system, it's going to say that those cows were delivered that concentrate, and unfortunately the cows simply left it behind in the AMS as they walked away. We've also shown in relation to this concept that as we start increasing the amount of concentrate delivered through the AMS, there is a reduction in PMR intake. So not only are we actually getting more concentrate into those cows, but it's altering their feeding behavior and they're decreasing their PMR intake. And in some studies, we show that that has no effect on dry matter intake. In some cases, we might have a moderate increase in dry matter intake. And there's even a few studies that have shown that that increasing concentrate actually numerically decreases dry matter intake. This happens in many studies. So this is a very consistent response where when we have higher concentrate allocation delivered in the AMS, we see lower PMR intake, and again, no net change in total dry matter intake when factoring in both the AMS concentrate and the PMR. So really, as we start shifting that AMS concentrate allocation, cows are responding by changing their PMR intake, and this may or may not lead to diets that are lower in physically effective fiber and may actually increase the dietary starch, depending on what that AMS pellet is comprised of. When we look across all the studies that I've been able to pull out based on published data, we can see that the response is quite variable. And in this case, we're looking at a substitution rate. So this is the amount of change in PMR intake as pellet intake goes up. So if we see a number over 1, that means they have a greater reduction in PMR intake than the corresponding increase in pellet intake. What I want to highlight here really challenges the ability to simply use precision feeding programs, because we don't know if cows are going to decrease their PMR intake by 1.14 kilos, whether they're going to decrease their PMR intake by 2 kilos, or whether they're only going to decrease their PMR intake by maybe 0.5 or 0.58 kilos. So this really leads to a lot of uncertainty in terms of the cow response. The other thing we've been able to show is that when we offer high quantities of concentrate in the pellet, it leads to more day-to-day variability for the cows. So this is the amount of variability in AMS pellet delivered to an individual cow across days. And so we would like this number to be as low as possible. And what you can clearly see is that when we go to the higher concentrate allocations, we result in higher variation in the amount that's delivered to a cow on a daily basis. And this is not only shown here at the U of S in a guided flow barn, but this has also been shown to be true at the University of Guelph in their free flow facility and in Dutch data with their free flow facility. Myth 3, does feeding management need to differ between free flow and guided flow? And the industry suggestions probably imply that we need to feed more concentrate in free flow barns to encourage those cows to voluntarily visit relative to a milk first, or even maybe relative to a feed first guided flow barn. The argument I'm going to make is the response of cows really doesn't differ. And I think this is simply because cows do not know what their traffic flow is. And because of that, they don't know whether they should be eating more or less concentrate in the robot. So this is the response from a free flow barn. In this case, they were feeding a low or a high concentrate allocation. You can see when they were fed the high AMS concentrate allocation, they decreased PMR intake, just like what I've shown you in our free flow work. And you can see very clearly there's no effect on milk yield. And in this study, there was also no effect on milk component concentration or milk component yield. If you look at another free flow barn, this is the Danish group, and in this case, they're looking at concentrate intake. We can see a lot of variability in concentrate intake for those cows that are offered high amounts, very consistent with what I've shown you from our guided flow work. And when we feed lower and static quantities of concentrate throughout lactation, we can see very nice, consistent, and regular intake of the allocated and targeted amount. So then when we take all that data and we look at the dietary strategies and we look at the visit or milk yield response, really across the board, whether it's free flow barns identified in blue or guided flow barns identified in white, you can see the responses are actually quite similar. And so to me, this really challenges whether we need to think about feeding management differently between guided and free flow barns, and recognize that that partial mixed ration contributes a substantial amount to the ability to get those cows to the robot. Finally, the question I want to address, or the myth I want to address, is whether we need to feed a pellet. And so this is a recently published study in the Journal of Dairy Science. This was a study where we took the same lot of barley, we either pelleted it or we provided it as steamrolled barley. Obviously, a straight barley pellet would not be very common, but it gave us an opportunity to really look at form rather than ingredient inclusion. What we did see here was that milking numbers tended to be reduced for those cows that were fed the steamrolled barley. The time between milkings tended to be increased for cows fed steamrolled barley relative to pellet. The holding area time, we are in a guided flow barn, was actually longer for those cows that were fed steamrolled rather than pelleted barley. And as a consequence, milking time was also reduced for those cows fed steamrolled barley relative to pelleted barley. So in this study, it was relatively short. We didn't see a milk yield response or a fat yield response. But what I would argue is that with extended periods of time, we would probably see carryover effects caused by these potentially increased intermilking intervals and maybe even reduced milking numbers for these cows. Okay, so let's get back right to the start, challenging the myths. Obviously, you can see my opinion based on the coloring of these points. I'm going to call false to feeding more concentrate in the AMS will reduce the negative energy balance for those early lactation cows. I'm going to say that altering quantities of concentrate in the AMS probably won't allow for precision feeding programs, at least to date. I'm going to say that feeding management probably does not need to differ between guided and free flow barns. And I'm going to say, well, maybe not pellets are required, but I think they could be useful to help encourage voluntary attendance. With that, I hope I've stimulated some thought. I have to give credit to the funders for helping support our work, and that's Sask Milk, Dairy Farmers of Manitoba, Alberta Milk, the old ALMA, so now known as RDR, and the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture. And of course, we wouldn't have this data without the graduate students and the technicians that do all the work to collect this information, including Keisha Paddock, who's on the panel here today.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I had no idea you could debunk that many myths in 15-ish minutes. So I think there will be lots of questions and people will probably think about what they're doing at their farm. So I'm pretty sure there will be many questions coming up. So with this, I'd like to open it up to the discussion and Q&A periods. We have two facilitators today, Holger Schwichtenberg and Keisha Paddock. Holger is a dairy producer in BC, and he serves as the chair of the British Columbia Dairy Association. And Keisha is, as Greg already referred to, did her master's under the supervision of Dr. Greg Penner. And currently she works as a ruminant technical specialist at More Than Just Feed. So both facilitators, I think, already have turned on their camera. And with that, I would like to turn it over to you, Keisha and Holger.
Thank you very much for the great presentation, Greg, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today as part of the panel. We have our first question here, and the question is, what does it mean when you say cows don't know what their traffic flow is?
Oh, thanks for that question. That's an excellent comment that I should probably clarify. So first of all, I don't think cows recognize or have understood the differences between free flow and guided traffic. So that's really what I'm referring to. The other aspect that I want to emphasize, and Keisha really did this work, spent an enormous amount of time looking at the timestamps for where cows were in our guided flow barn. And to me, what was really shocking was cows did not know that they were in a feed-first guided traffic flow barn. So when we looked at that data, sometimes cows would leave their free stalls, they would go to the PMR because we are feed first, and then they would go through the sort gate to determine whether they have milking permission and have access to the PMR. And then after, sometimes cows would go back to the free stalls, so they would actually follow the classical book on what the traffic flow should have been. But there were a lot of cows that also ignored that PMR meal before milking. So they actually, I guess, changed their traffic flow to a milk first system. And there were some cows that chose to go through the system without any reward. So maybe they thought they were actually in a free flow barn. And so the point I want to make is just because cows may be in a guided traffic flow and it might be classified as feed first or milk first, does not mean that they have to perform those activities. And it does not mean that they always perform those activities in that order. And I think sometimes that concept of having a feed first or milk first implies that those cows have to pass through the barn in that nature. But the cows can make different decisions.
Okay, Greg, thank you for that. Now, being a rookie at this, I noticed that Keisha looked up to see the question. So I'm just wondering what the strategy is where did you look to see the next question on the Q&A? Keisha, if you just help me out there, where did that come up?
Down at the bottom, there's a Q&A box on your taskbar, and I just flipped it up into a different window.
Yeah, it said no open questions. I'm just wondering what. I can just go to the chat line too if you'd like me to do that. But also, just personally speaking, Greg, it was interesting to listen to your chat because we're 3 years into an AMS system, and every one of those things that you addressed has, of course, has come up at some point. So you had my complete and total attention when you were talking about. And also, I just maybe for clarification, Greg, just do you call them myths or just, is that as too strong a word? I'm just going to throw that at you.
Yeah, maybe I should have called them myths or truths, or challenge which one they were. I think the first three that I addressed were myths. They're often communicated as being fact or being important factors, and I think the research does not support those statements. So those I would call myths. Whether we need to feed a pellet, I think that one still may be up for debate. I know a lot of producers that are using on-farm feeds and are having good success with those on-farm feeds, and so maybe that one's not such a myth. It's more of a farm-specific scenario and working out how to get cows to visit the robot even without a pellet.
So then I just wanted to just add one more question here, Greg. Like I've got several dairy farm neighbors who decided to use the free flow, what's it called? The forced floor, whatever, this is where you actually have to go through the sort gate before, and they based that on the fact that they wanted the animals, they wanted to feed less in the robot and more in the PMR. And so they spent a lot of time and effort and decided on a particular system. And here you are telling me that doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. I would just maybe explain that a bit more, please. Because again, I think a lot of time and effort went into this, and you're calling it a myth or something that's maybe not 100% accurate.
Yeah, so I think, and Keisha, I'd love to hear your comment on this as a practicing nutritionist, but from what I see in Saskatchewan and the work we've done at the University of Guelph, we can do a great job attracting cows to the robot in free flow barns. And we can do that even with pretty energy dense partial mixed rations. So I think the concept of lazy cows caused by high energy PMRs maybe is not fully supported. And if we do a good job pushing up feed and delivering feed or delivering fresh feed, we can encourage those cows to get out of their stalls, go have a bite at the PMR, and hopefully also have the interest to have a positive experience in the AMS. So I think, when we compare the feeding strategies, there doesn't need to be a lot of difference between guided flow and free flow barns. Where I think the guided flow traffic might have a little different philosophy is in how we deal with fetched cows, and maybe the need for human intervention to fetch cows. So those sort gates or selection gates could be considered as non-human labor. So they are hopefully, with the permission settings, helping to divert cows into that holding area to allow them to be milked, rather than maybe fetching. Now, the reason I say maybe is I think there's a lot of data coming out that is starting to suggest that fetching rates between guided flow and free flow barns are not as great as they used to be. So our dairy producers are getting more and more clever and figuring out other strategies to encourage those cows to voluntarily enter the AMS, and maybe relying less on fetching and relying less on sort gates.
Okay, so Keisha, I actually have a question up here, and I think I'm going to seize the opportunity in case it's the last one I see. But we have a question here from Hendrik. Is there any research on feeding types, two types of pellets feeds in the robot? For example, feeding an additional glycol type pellet or even a glycol liquid for the early lactation cows? So over to you, Greg.
That's a great question. And yeah, all the work I showed was a single pellet commodity at increasing concentration, or at least that was the bulk of it. There is new work that's going on at the University of Guelph. Trevor DeVries is leading that work, and they're looking at molasses supplementation. So not glycol, but still has a sugar component, which might reduce risk for ketosis in early lactation. And from what I understand, there are some positive responses so far. But really, the data is very limited. I'm only aware of one experiment that has tested this concept.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Go ahead, Keisha.
I have a follow-up question, Greg, from one of your earlier comments. So with increasing feed prices, there's been a lot of interest from industry producers looking at different types of commodities, some being like low quality alfalfa type pellets, even some types of meals. Do you have any recommendations as to how they should go about evaluating those feed types, either before they get them or when they bring them in?
Yeah, so I guess my thought on feed type is influenced by the past literature. So there was some excellent work done in Denmark where they compared different types of pellets, and they had grass pellets included in this study. And generally, when you shifted away from starch-based pellets, cows voluntarily chose to enter the robot less frequently, and they actually chose to consume less pellet when they were in the robot. So I think type of pellet will have an impact. I shared the work that we did comparing pelleted versus flaked barley. And in our guided flow barn, we were able to detect some behavioral responses for those cows. So I think form will have an impact, or may have an impact on the voluntary attendance, but that doesn't override the economic question, which I think is really the driver behind this. So if I was to be thinking of other pellets to be used in the AMS, if I was to use a pellet, I would be focusing on pellet hardness and pellet durability. And on top of that, a percent fines. So I would like to see a very durable pellet, probably over 97, 98% durability. And I would like to see very low proportion of percent fines in that final product. If I was choosing to move away from pellet and go to a mash feed or another physical form, my primary concern would be on consistency of calibration for the AMS. So how well is that AMS actually delivering the quantity of feed that we think it is? And so all of these are based on auger turns. And so we need to make sure that we're calibrating and actually know how much feed is being delivered by that AMS. And that variability may increase as we move from a pellet, which is a highly dense, pretty uniform feed, to a mash or another type of feed source, which probably has more variability and a lower density.
So Greg, while you're talking about calibration, how often would you suggest a farm or producer should, once a week, once every 2 weeks, how often should they be calibrating?
Yeah, the calibration can be done pretty quickly. I would say the minimum frequency should be around receiving new product. And it's not just the receival of the new product, it's when that new product probably starts flowing into the bin. So if you have a hopper bottom bin, it's not going to flow in immediately, but it will be flowing in depending on the quantity of the new pellet. As a general management practice at our facility, we calibrate weekly. But that said, our deviation or the variation around that calibration variable is pretty low when we're dealing with a consistent pellet type.
Okay, thanks, Greg. So we have a comment more than a question here from Matthew. One of the most important things for no-fetch cows is barn design. Placing a crossover beside your robots is a very good way to get visits in the free flow system. So maybe not so much what's in the robot, but making sure it's very accessible. And yeah, so maybe comment on that, please.
Yeah, I think this is part of the art associated with automated milking systems, right? We've attributed a lot to nutrition, but I think stockmanship, maybe the argument was made we could move away from cow people as we adopt robot milking, but I don't think that's actually true. I think we need to make sure we are handling those cattle in a low stress environment and creating a rewarding experience when we do have to encourage them to enter the AMS. Having all of the freedoms in terms of crossovers and water access and access to PMR are really, really critical management factors that can help make a barn successful.
We have a question here wondering if you can speak about what type of housing was used to debunk those myths. So free stalls or compost packs, and does that make a difference?
Great question. So all of the work that I am aware of has been done in freestall barns, except for a couple publications that are in grazing cattle that still have access to an AMS. I've been able or fortunate enough to work with some US consultants that also consult in Argentina, and they are dealing with a lot of bedding pack systems. And the bedding pack systems may offer some different challenges. Maintenance of that bedding pack is obviously critical from a animal hygiene standpoint. And it seems like there might be some more challenge, at least in the existing barns that I've been talking with people about, to get cows to voluntarily enter that AMS, at least when they're dealing with those bedding packs. I think in the end, we haven't changed the cow. We've just changed what barn design the cow is in. And so I would rather focus on cow physiology and behavioral characteristics of the cow and encourage those voluntary visits. And I don't think we are actually changing the nature of the cow. So the cows still have, the opportunity to move around. They have opportunity for social interaction. They have a drive to eat. They have a drive for water. And we're trying to present all those options and encourage that voluntary attendance to the milking. And that's part of the foundation behind why I think cow traffic flow probably doesn't matter as much as it's been commented to.
We had another question here. An anonymous person asked, how about, I think they spelled the word mesh, but I think they meant mash. So I think you were talking about pellets and you talked about a flake product. What about the good old dairy techs that we used to have in our own parlors?
Yeah, and I was trying to address that before. I think the main issue with the mash products or texturized products is variability related to that calibration. Okay. Again, because it's auger flighting, do you get the same quantity flowing through per turn of the auger? And I would suspect that your calibration confidence might decrease as you go to those more texturized or mash type feeds.
Do you know of anyone that is using a mash in their robots?
I know of groups that are using corn gluten feed, which would be classified as a mash type feed. It's not pelleted, and from what I hear, they are getting away with it or are happy with the outcome. I think a lot of the decision that needs to be made is the economic opportunity associated with the change in feed and the relative impact on milk and milk fat yield. So I know of producers that are doing this. Could they get more visits if they switched feed? Maybe, but it probably comes at a cost that might not also be justified.
So again, there's not a question right now in the chat or Q&A. So Greg, I have another question for you. Again, in our farm or our facility, we're feeding up to 7.5 kilograms in the robots for high producing early lactation cows. I think you were at 5.5. Does a number like 7.5 concern you?
Does it concern me? Probably not. I would assume you're working with a nutritionist, and that nutritionist will be applying good ration balancing principles. So I wouldn't want to challenge the credibility of the nutritionist. The question I would have is, are you achieving those targets in the AMS? And if you are not, what is the implication on what you think you're delivering to those cows versus what you're actually delivering? So I've been able to have good discussions with people within Lely and people within DeLaval. I have yet to be able to convince them to provide easily accessible reports that break pellet dispensed amounts by stage of production or level within a feed table. And to me, that's really what I would be looking at. I would be looking for, are those cows that are targeting 7.5 kilos or whatever your target is actually receiving that amount? And how consistent do they get that amount? So different systems have different carryover rules, right? They might have an average of 7.5, but one day might be 10 and the next day might be 5, right? And we really need to understand that variability, or I think there's value in understanding that variability to know how well we are actually meeting our targets and whether we could actually make improvements by adjusting up or down the amount of pellet that is programmed to be delivered.
So if you're balancing it out, one day the cow's at 5.5, next day at 10, and again, you're also feeding some concentrate in the PMR, is there any concern that that cow on certain days could be getting more than she's actually physically capable of dealing with?
Yeah, that's a loaded question.
Okay.
So we've done a lot of work with ruminally cannulated cows that allow us to measure pH in the rumen continuously. One of the interesting aspects is that despite really looking and trying, I cannot pick out an AMS milking event on pH. Now that might be because in our facility, we have a maximum meal size at 2.5 kilos. And so what that tells me is a 2.5 kilo meal size probably is not sufficient to drop rumen pH. That said, I can pick up PMR visits. So we have Incintec bunks, so we know when cows were eating their PMR, and we know how much they ate. And I can show that that PMR eating event causes a reduction in pH. So that probably suggests that, at a 2.5 kilo meal size in the robot, we're not going to have a reduction in pH that is non-manageable by the cow. But if we go into a situation where she's in a carryover position, so maybe she has 10 kilos available rather than 7.5, and she still eats a lot of PMR, we could get into a situation that encourages a decline in pH. And really, this has kind of been one of the bugs that I've been picking, is we need to quit thinking about feeding management in automated milking systems as the robot. It's really the robot feed plus the PMR. And the PMR is probably 90%, depending on the concentrate allocation. So 85 to 90% of the daily nutrient intake.
Thanks. And back to you, Keisha. There's a comment there in the chat box.
There's a comment here. It looks like regarding the mash. Yep, the person meant mash with regards to feeding a pellet versus steamrolled or a mash. So
I hope I went through that, with the experiment we conducted, as well as, some of the comments related to calibration and potential variability. The other aspect related to that is eating rate. So we know that cows can eat more pellet per minute than they can of a steam flake product, and they can eat more steam flake product than they can of a mash. So that may be part of it if you're dealing with higher concentrate allocations or higher meal sizes. do the cows have sufficient time in the AMS to actually consume the whole meal that has been dispensed?
I have a follow-up question to the one Holger had asked previously. So you talked a little bit about the substitution rate, so the reduction in PMR intake with concentrate allowance in the AMS. Do you think that varies at all depending on days in milk or milk production?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have lots of hypotheses around that. So we think there's probably a greater substitution effect for those cows in early lactation. We have yet to prove that, but I think there is a good kind of biology basis behind that. We think those cows in peak lactation probably respond less in terms of substitution. And then again, I would expect that there's a greater substitution effect for those cows in late lactation. We have not been able to break that data out yet because that does require individual feed intake for individual animals across lactation so that we can balance all those effects. But that's exactly what we would think would happen. The other concept that I think underlies that, and we've shown this at least partial, is higher energy dense PMRs probably have a greater substitution effect than lower energy dense PMRs. We also think there may be a substitution effect driven by the composition of the pellet. I think higher starch pellets probably drive a greater substitution effect. And I think higher protein pellets probably drive a lower substitution effect relative to lower protein pellets. That's work that we are going to start very soon. So thanks Alberta Milk and RDAR for supporting that work. And I hope I can share those outcomes over the next few years.
There's a comment here made by somebody. If there's anything left to say about trying to feed higher performing cows differently or individually in an AMS system, rather than having sort of a carte blanche that you can actually individualize, I don't know, based on days in milk or body condition, that you can actually feed each cow differently in an AMS system.
And I think that's the ultimate goal, and that's the goal I want to achieve, is to be able to actually apply a precision feeding program based on those cows' individual needs. There's some fantastic work that came out of the University of Florida, and they fed cows like that in individual feeding systems. So they reformulated the diet for individual cows every week based on their dry matter intake and their milk energy output and their body weight and body condition score change. And they had enormous improvements. I think it was a 5 or 6 kilo improvement daily over the whole lactation when they used a precision feeding approach versus a standard, TMR approach for those cows. So I think there's an enormous potential opportunity there. The challenge for us to get there, I think, with robotic systems is, one, knowing what that PMR intake is, because the PMR intake is the bulk of the nutrients. It's convincing the robot manufacturers to not only record what is dispensed to those cows, but also what those cows leave behind. So my dream robot would include a load cell on the feed manger so that we know how much feed was left behind by an individual cow, and that could change how much feed is dispensed for the next cow to avoid that carryover, at least if we're dealing with a single feed allocation in the AMS. If we can accomplish those two tasks, we have all the information, or the potential to collect all the information we need for precision feeding programs. We can measure regular body weight. We know milk yield in some systems, and it wouldn't be a hard change to know milk composition. So from those variables, we can predict that energy output, and we could measure that energy intake. And I think we could actually achieve much higher milk production in robotic milking systems than we could in a conventional parlor.
So Greg, when you're having those discussions with the manufacturers, I mean, you're obviously quite convinced this is the road to go. What is the pushback? What is the argument that's saying, you know, we're not ready for this? Or what is their counter argument?
I think they are moving forward. So there are body condition score cameras that are coming out. Some robotic milking systems allow for body weight measurements. Some already allow for milk composition measurements. So I think they're advancing. But these technology changes have to be palatable for the producers that are going to pay for them. They also need to have a net benefit for the manufacturers that are installing them. So if they don't see a business opportunity for this, it will be difficult for them to justify the cost associated with development of revised algorithms, development of the revised equipment. And we still have that PMR challenge, right? Where we still need PMR intake at an individual level in a group feeding situation. I think that's probably the greatest hurdle. But if we could achieve that outcome and actually no individual PMR intake in a group fed situation, we could not only help robotic milking feeding systems, but we could also help conventional TMR fed herds.
So Greg, one of the questions that I get asked pretty frequently is about heifer versus cows in the robot. What's your perspective on how to approach feeding with them?
So this is completely non-scientific. Our approach on our farm is we treat them identically. We have a very non-conventional system where we do not use feed tables, and we feed the same amount of pellet from the start of lactation to the end of lactation. And so we are really treating our robot as a milk harvesting system, and our PMR really is a TMR in our case. In startup herds that I've heard about, heifer training has been a challenge, to say the best. And I think it's really about creating a positive experience for those heifers. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to use, let's call them dummy robots, to give those heifers experience to that robotic system prior to freshening. I think when we're dealing with retraining of cows calving for their second or third time into the robot, that training or retraining experience is much more rapid. And so I think, you know, if we can apply those concepts to the heifers prior to their first lactation, there may be an opportunity to decrease the training burden.
So, Greg, there's a comment here in the chat box. How would you suggest to improve the flow of information of the study results to dairy producers and AMS experts? Because the debunked myths that you addressed today seem to be generally unknown. Like, for example, some of the things you stated today, I've been in an AMS system for 3 years and I had not heard some of these arguments. So again, the flow of information back to the users.
That's a great question. I think today is a good example of some of those efforts. So Alberta Milk and DRECA in general does a great job. We try to get out as much as possible presenting this type of information to industry. And so whether that be at the Western Canadian Dairy Seminar or more local extension activities, we have the Sask Milk Dairy Info Day, where this type of information has been presented. We work, we've wrote several extension articles to progressive dairymen to make sure that kind of that magazine audience is receiving the information. And I can personally tell you, I have never declined an invitation to talk about robotic milking systems anywhere in the world. And both Trevor and I have been fortunate to communicate findings like this in the UK, down in the US. I've worked with very large consulting firms, you know, feeding over 1 million cows in the US and provided training workshops for them on automated milking systems. So I think it's coming. The other challenge I think we're dealing with is really to make sure that producers are aware of these concepts and which ones might be myths and which ones might be situationally dependent. And so if you think about this from a nutritionist standpoint, if they come in and they make what could be perceived as a radical change. Let's be honest, and there's a lot of competition in the feed industry. So if the producer has concerns over production, which may or may not be directly related to the feeding strategy in the barn, and another nutritionist comes in and says, well, they're doing things wrong, we should be using feed tables, we should be doing these other things, that initial nutritionist that was being bold might lose the client that they really want. And so there is risk from the feeding side to adopt these practices until they become more common, or unless they have very loyal clients that are willing to go through the time and experience the outcomes that I think are pretty consistent from a research perspective.
So Greg, we're just getting towards the end here. There's no more questions. Actually, there's something in the chat box, I think is pertaining to our schedule here, that we have no more questions in the Q&A. I'm just going to toss one little nugget at you because I'm an AMS guy. Just a Reader's Digest condensed version on fetch cows. How aggressive should you be? My son works for De La Valle, Saskatchewan, says, ignore them. Other people are very, very particular. What are your thoughts?
I think fetch cows is an area we need to focus on. I think stockmanship plays a large role. My philosophy is we do not want to create a habit with fetch cows. We don't want those cows learning to be fetched. And there are ways that we can create a positive experience in the AMS through good stockmanship skills. So by applying pressure when they're at positions away from the AMS and providing release of that pressure as they approach the AMS and enter. And so I think we still have a training experience, but we don't want those cows to train us to fetch them on a routine basis. How to achieve that, I think, still requires more work.
Okay, thank you for that, Greg. We're going to, Keisha and I are going to hand it back over to Anna Marika just to end it up here.
I have one more question actually, and I think it might be maybe both for Greg and Holger, but for a dairy producer that has robots, like what data on the computer should they be looking at? Like, are you looking at refused feeds, rest feeds? What's important? Like, what do you look at to know how things are going?
Holger, do you want to take the first kick at the can here?
Okay, so for us, it's been more of a, because of my advanced age, okay, I'm saying that facetiously, I have not nearly as much to do in the new robotic milking system as I used to have in our old milking parlor. That's just been kind of a natural progression. We have an employee working for us who is very, very keen on this, and I'm certainly part of it, but the individual day-to-day work, I am not part of, and I think it was rather sad is maybe the wrong word, but it was just sort of a natural development. So the information I'm simply looking at is, are there any fetch cows? Are they more than 5 hours out? And are there any sharp decreases in milk production? That's really all I'm looking for. And I do pay close attention to the fresh cow list because I'm kind of all over that. But for the rest, I do not look as much as I used to. Full disclosure.
So maybe if I could jump in addition to the standard kind of dashboard outputs, I think there would be a lot of utility in breaking down that information a little deeper. And we do this quite regularly. So there's a couple things I look at and that's cow flow by hour through the AMS. And I want to make sure that we have not adjusted feeding times or push-up times in such a way that creates robot activity that isn't rewarded with a milking. So for example, I want to make sure that my wash times are optimized relative to times of low natural activity in our AMS. And so I look at those reports in terms of cow activities to understand when those should be. From a feeding perspective, I would really like to see the feed table levels broken down so that we know the amount of feed delivered. And so this could be rest feed if you're in a lay system, right? The amount of feed not delivered that is still remaining. Or if you're in a De La Valle system, the amount of feed that was actually offered to those cows relative to what they should have got based on their feed table and the standard deviation or coefficient of variation associated with that so that we can look at how consistent those responses are over time. And I think this will have a pretty good impact to understand what level of feeding is achievable and consistent in automated milking systems. And because of that, how should we maybe consider altering the partial mixed ration formulation?
Okay, Keisha, now we'll hand it over to Anna Marika. Are we good?
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah.
Thank you both. And thank you also, Greg, for answering many, many questions. And thank you to all the attendees for joining us today. I think it was very interesting to hear a lot of the practical tips and tricks around feeding and automated milking systems. And thank you so much, Holger and Keisha, for facilitating this. It was a very nice conversation, and we know that many people watch the recordings instead of being here live. So I think they have a really nice hour to listen to. So thank you to all three of you for being here, for your time, and for this interesting conversation. For the attendees, I have a request. Basically, after you log out of this webinar, you will be asked to take a survey. It's not a long survey, but it would help us a lot to understand how to improve these coffee talks and other DRECA events better. So please, if you could, please take the survey, because that would help us a lot. Yeah, and we will send everyone a recording of today's talk at the beginning of next week. And yeah, with that, this was basically the last coffee talk of this series. So thank you everyone for attending this or many other coffee talks, and we'll look at the survey results to see how we can improve these types of events, and then hopefully at some point we will organize something like this again. So have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure. Take care, everybody.
Thank you as well.
Bye-bye. Bye, Greg.
See you later. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.